a free pattern today. McCall's 7948. Right now it's free from Minerva. It's one of their spring patterns. It's very in style. It's got gathers and ruffles and all kinds of things that are really floating around right now for the summer and coming in a little bit in the early fall. So it's a great pattern because it's free. I mean, you know, you can't beat free. You do have to print it, download it, print it out, tape it together. So it's a PDF pattern. And all the information on the pattern and the fabric and everything will be in the click through down below. In addition to that, there'll be a link to how to tape your PDF pattern together. You can just look for it here because it just takes a few minutes, but you have to really pay attention to what you're doing. Personally, I'm not a big fan of PDF patterns. That things come undone, but it was free and I wanted to do this pattern for you. So today with this pattern, we are going to talk about facings. I never ever put in facings, and this time I decided to show you how to do a beautiful facing. So we're going to put a facing in for this dress. We are also going to do really nice side pockets that are actually captured in the umpire waist, so they're not flopping around. So they're beautifully drafted pockets. We are going to put a button loop on the back because there's no zippers in this and no buttonholes. There's almost like a keyhole opening in the back, and what we're going to do is put a button and then sew a loop to go around that to close that up. We're also doing the keyhole opening in the facing, so that's a really good one. And then we're doing gathers on the sleeves and pleats on the bottom of the dress, and gathers are everywhere. This flowy, soft cotton lawn kind of fabric with gathers is just about on every runway for spring and summer. So let's get started. All right, we are going to start by getting our facings prepped. One of the first things you need to do is add interfacing to the neck pieces. I want to talk about this really quickly for a minute. I use tricot. I sell it in my Etsy store. It's stretchy, which is nice because even though this is a woven, it's still going to move, and you don't want the interfacing to come away from the fabric. The other thing you want to think about when you're ironing this, and those of you that know me know I talk about this all the time, you lay a piece of scrap fabric down on your ironing board, and then you put your piece that's going to be interfaced right side down, and then add the interfacing, and then cover it again with another piece of cloth. And don't use your good press cloth, use a scrap. And then you want to put your iron down and hold it, count to 10, pick it up, put it down again, hold it, count to 10, all the way across the piece. Once it's done, you can move your iron back and forth, but until that time, you can't see it because it's sandwiched between two pieces of fabric, and you don't want it to move on you. The other thing is you can see that it's not like cut perfectly. So this it sticks to whatever it's going to be touching. So this would be sticking to your ironing board cover, which is miserable and it turns it black. So we don't want to do that. The other thing I did is I overlocked the edges. If you have a serger or an overlocker, it's a good idea to finish off the edges. They're pretty on the inside. If you turn them, you're going to get a ridge, and when you go back and iron the dress over and over again, you're going to end up with a ridge around your neckline, so we don't want that. I would pink them, very old school, or do a step zigzag. You have a zigzag on your machine that goes doot, 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 cross back and forth, or even a stretch stitch, something that will just finish up that edge, right? And so this is piece 3 and 4, and we've sewn them together. We've sewn the interfacing on. And we're going to sew them together at the shoulder seam. This is a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on this dress. So keep that in mind as you sew them. And if you overlock them or serge them, then you can press them to the back or to the front and press your shoulder seams on your top in the opposite direction. If you don't, you can press them open, but you want them in at least in opposite, either open or in opposite direction. So that will make our little neck circle. And we're going to take piece 1 of our taped together pattern. And the other thing I do, especially with something like this, right, there is a difference between both sides, but it's not apparent when you look at it right away. I don't want to have to fiddle every time I go to pick up a piece. Is this the right side? Is this the wrong side? So as I cut them out, I throw a pin in the right side. So I know that this is the right side of my front. It's facing up. And I have another piece of, these tape patterns are crazy, but this is a free pattern, so we'll see how this goes. And then I have a pin in this back piece, and so I know that it goes this way. So now I don't have to futz with what's the right side and what's the wrong side. I mean, if it's obvious, if you have a beautiful pattern and it's obvious, that's one thing, but for this particular fabric, it's very similar on one side and against the other. So I'm going to sew the shoulder seams together on the top so I can apply my neck facing, and that's kind of the first thing you want to do. Now I know a lot of you are saying, oh, she's putting facing on, she hates facings. I do. I really don't like facings, but because this is a little summer dress and I didn't want to go through the process of making a fully lined bodice, and because I haven't done facings in a while, I wanted to make sure that everybody could see the process of sewing a facing on. They're not my favorite because they pop out, but because this is such a casual dress, I'm going to do some top stitching on it, which will help hold it in place. So we're going to sew the shoulder seams on the top and sew the shoulder seams on the facing, and then we're going to apply the facing to the top. Here's our top. I've sewn the shoulder seams together and pressed the seams towards the back, finished them and pressed them towards the back, and then here is our neck edge piece, which I've sewn into a loop, and I've pressed the seams towards the front. This short piece here is the front, and this long piece is the back, because we're going to sew down into this and cut into it in order to be able to get into our garment, because this neck hole is not going to go over my head for sure. So the first thing you want to do is match up the shoulder seams. You want a good match on the shoulder seams. You can, if you have one seam allowance going to the left and one seam allowance going to the right, you can just butt them right up together, and it gives you, you can feel it, you can move your fingers. It gives you a really good juncture. Plus you don't have two seam allowances like you're trying to sew over them. You have one going one way and one going the other way. So I'm going to do the same thing with the other half at the other shoulder seam. I'm going to butt these seams together, and then I'm going to go around and pin this neck edge. And because we cut them both the same size, they should fit perfectly. Oh, look at that. And they do. Ha, happy days. So the back one will also fit perfectly. I'm going to match that up. And then we need to mark up our stitching line on this back piece. Now you could mark that when you cut the pieces out, but I like to do it just before, because then I don't have to put a really heavy mark in it and I don't have to worry about it going somewhere, right? Because I'm going to stitch around here and then down and back up again. So here is my back piece, piece 4, and you can see that there's a stitching line that goes all the way down to here. Wherever your size is, that's where it stops, your stitching line. So we're going to put this down on our pattern, and I'm going to mark the stitching line on this side, and I'm going to mark the stitching line on this side. Now if you've already done it, that's great. I didn't do it because I wanted to interface this before I marked it, so this makes it a little bit easier for me. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to go back and mark these lines, and I'm going to stitch off. I'm going to start here at the corner. I'm going to stitch all the way around, and I'm going to stitch off a little bit, or I'm going to stitch forward and back up, and then go down here and back up, back and forth, and then back up here and back and forth before I turn. Because I'm not going to cut this until after I've sewn it. That will make so much more sense. But if you try to do a pivot here, so if you put your needle down and you lift everything up and you spin it and you try to do a pivot, if your needle hasn't engaged, your upper thread and your bottom thread haven't engaged together, you're going to get a diagonal, and you're not going to get it. You'll never get a good corner out of that. So if you come up to this point your 5/8 inch seam allowance, put the needle down, back it up, go forward, put the needle down again, go, and then turn it, and then pivot, and then go forward a stitch and back a stitch. You'll have guaranteed yourself that you actually have sunk that stitch into the seam allowance. So that's really important. So we're going to go ahead and take care of that, and then I'll show you how to clip it and turn it and understitch it and top stitch it so it looks fabulous. Here we are at the sewing machine, and I have put 2 pins. This is my center back pin, and I've put pins on either side where that stitch mark is, and then an X where I need to get to. But certainly, if you're at all nervous about it, you should draw lines. And I'm going to start at what would be one juncture here, this side, where I'm going to start and stop. So I'm right in where that pin is. And I'm going to take 2 stitches forward and then 2 stitches back. And then I'm going to slowly go around my neck edge, making sure I don't have any crinkles, and that these shoulder seams, one's going left and one's going right. I try to keep the pins in there on these seam junctures as long as I can without sewing over them. You know, if you're at all worried about this going together the way you want it to, just baste it. Use a big long machine basting stitch, and then if you're happy with it, you can go back and stitch it with a regular length stitch. For this fabric, I'm using 2.5, 2.4, because the fabric's pretty lightweight. Come to that second pin on the edge of the neck where I'm going to be cutting it. So I want to stop here, and I want to back up 2 stitches, and then I'm going to come forward, and then I'm going to pivot. I think I'll leave that one in there. Now I'm just going to aim my machine at this cross down here, but if you have a line, you'll follow your line. So you go take 2 stitches and then back up 2, because we want to make sure we get a really nice sharp angle. And I'm going to come right down to my point. And I'm going to back stitch again, and then come forward and then pivot. And now I'm going to aim back up at this other pin here. I'm going to take 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back, and come up to the pin. Which is right where I started. And I'm going to take a couple stitches back, couple stitches forward, and I am going to pivot once more because I missed a couple of stitches on this end from where I am, so I'm just going to finish that. And that's it. So I have, it's hard to see with the white on the white, but I have this stitching that goes from here all the way around, comes down to the point, and back up again. And now I'm going to trim it, and we're going to turn it. Okay, I finished off the inside edge of the circle. I did not finish this off because I didn't want to, serging that is a little tricky, so I didn't want to do it. But if you just turned this inside right now, it would be very difficult. You can see that it's not very pretty. There's bumps and lumps. It would be very hard to get this to the way I want it. So in the front, where it's curved, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm just going to cut into the seam allowance to the seam allowance, but not to the stitching, but not through the stitching. And without even pressing this, you can see that already the fabric is like, oh yeah, okay, I can turn, I can do that. Because what it does is it releases that stress on the inside of the fabric. I mean, that neck edge already looks pretty good and we haven't done anything to it yet. On the back, where this long piece is, we're going to clip right down the center. And it gets a little hairy as we get down towards the tip, but get as close as you can. All right. And that's one of the reasons why we backstitched here, because we want to have this really nice turned edge. So I'm going to go and understitch. That's the next thing I want to do. And basically what that is going to do is it's going to attach the facing to the seam allowance. So I'm going to press everything towards the seam allowance. The facing and the seam allowance will all go away from the top all the way around as best I can. You're not going to get all the way down into the bottom of this V, but you're going to do the very best you can. All right. And then after it's pressed, I'm going to take it to the machine, and look at how beautiful that juncture is, right? Because we press them either way. After I've done that, I'm going to take it to the machine. I'm going to understitch it. So I'm going to stitch the seam allowance to the facing. The dress is all on its own. And what this does is it connects the two, so turning it is like sublime. It makes it absolutely beautiful. I've pressed it. This fabric has something on it. It doesn't particularly care for my iron, so I have to use a press cloth, which annoys me a little bit because as I'm pressing it, I'm pressing wrinkles into it, but that's a problem for another day. So here's my corner. I'm not going to be able to get any stitching in there. My machine is only going to go so far. So I'm going to start at some point here by the corner, and I have the seam allowance and the facing. I'm going to slide them underneath my machine. Now, if you have a left stitch on your machine, that will help you because you want to get as close to this seam as possible. And this is just an internal structure seam, so there's no, you don't need to worry about back tacking or anything. We just want to kind of hold this open so we don't get any rumples. Separate the seam. You need like 3 hands for this job. Make sure the seam allowance and the facing stay on one side, plus it's a curve. Get as close to the seam as possible. Hold it open. It's a challenge in sewing, but you can feel, I can see, especially since we've clipped this seam, some of the pieces want to go that way towards the bodice, and we want to keep them in line with the facing. So you have to kind of pick it up, open it up, run a corner. Good news is no one's going to see this, right? It's all on the inside. But this step is so worth it because it's going to help keep our facing in place. And same thing, as I get to this edge, this square edge here, I'm not going to get all the way. I'm going to go as far as I can go. That's it. All right. So I've sewn this, and you can see my seam allowance is stuck to my facing now. And without even pressing it already, the facing is behaving the way it's supposed to. So I'm also going to do as much as I can on this length part in the back, right? So I'm going to stick this in the machine and do the very best I can. Even if I get a third of it, I'm going to be better off than not having any at all. And this is really tiny at the bottom, so don't beat yourself up if you can't get it. It's like an exercise in finger gymnastics. So you can see on this side, I only got from here to here. So I only did about 4 inches. That's fine. And I'm going to turn this corner. And when I turn a corner, I want to fold in one side on the seam allowance and fold in on the other side of the seam allowance because I want a beautiful corner. And then I'm going to put my thumb and fingers and I'm going to hold that. So you can see I have a really pretty corner there. And I want to just transfer that corner to the outside. And voila, right? That is the best way to do a corner. Now, if you had just pivoted there without back stitching, you could have a stitch going across this way. There's no way you're ever going to get a decent corner when you do that. So I'm going to finish up the other side. I'm going to press it all so there's no more wrinkles in it and press the facing to the inside, and we'll talk about what your options are for finishing the neck edge. All right, how's your top looking? I hope it looks terrific. One of the pitfalls of making this kind of a slit in your garment is that it gets a little rough and ready down here, and you may even have stitched too far, which I did. I had to unpick a little bit of it, but you want it to eventually lie flat. So clip, unpick some seams, and I'm going to top stitch this because I don't want this to unravel. There's a lot of teeny tiny raw seams there, and I'm going to wash it a couple of times and it's going to unravel. So I'm going to top stitch my garment. You know, I didn't print out the instructions when I printed out this dress because for me, it's just a construction process, and sometimes it's a little more interesting when I have to think about what I'm doing as opposed to just reading somebody else's instructions. Plus, I don't always think that they do like really nice finishing techniques. So I think that this may not be the way it is in the book, but this is the way that we're going to do it. Now, this is a pressing ham. Your grandmother probably had one. Many people don't have them in their sewing room or their sewing supplies. It's invaluable when you go to press. Sleeves, for instance, in particular, or collars if you want to train a collar. But for something like this, you can get this all laid out the way you want it, and we want it to lie flat. And before I pressed it, I stuck the pins go right into the press ham, and then I put my press cloth on and pressed it so it was exactly the way I wanted it, right? So I can hold it all down with the pins and then press it, even for this instance I couldn't see it, but even if you can see it, it's a marvelous tool. It's not very expensive, and they're certainly worth having around in your sewing room. So I use this all the time. If you don't have one of these, you can slide this on the end of your ironing board, and if you have a pad in your ironing board, you can do the same thing. You can push the pins. If you have these glass head pins, and I'll put a link to them in the video along with the ham, but the glass head pins allow the iron and the steamer to go over them without getting sticky and melty and all of that. They're really narrow so they don't put a hole in your nice fabric. So enough of I pin a soapbox pins on my soapbox about pins. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run a bead of stitching all the way around the neckline, down here, all the way around to keep this facing in place. If you have an edge foot, and it looks like this, it has this funky little thing sticking out of the bottom, and what happens is you can glide your edge of your fabric along this edge of the edge foot, and you have an absolutely perfect uniform stitch all the way around. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to edge stitch this neck edge, top stitch it essentially, and so it's, because you can see it's going to fall out. This will give it one more extra layer of protection. I mean, we understitched it and pressed it, and you could certainly, if you didn't want the top stitching, this is going to stay in place, and you can tack it down at the shoulder seams here on the inside. You can tack the facing down here on the shoulder seams if that's your preference and you prefer. I mean, if it was an expensive fabric, if I was using a really nice fabric, I probably wouldn't top stitch it because it makes it much more casual. So if you were making this a little dressier, there would be more hand stitching involved, and you could tack it here at the shoulder seams, tack the facing to the shoulder seams, and that will help keep it from popping out. But in this case, I'm going to top stitch it, and then I'm going to sew my side seams. Look at how great that neckline looks, huh? Terrific. So we sewed it, understitched it, top stitched it, and I am actually going to go back and just hand stitch this down, and that will give me an extra layer of protection to make sure that the facing does not pop out, because that is like one of my pet peeves. And then I sewed the side seams, so this top is ready for our sleeves. So let's talk about sleeves for a little bit. This is piece 10 I'm using for this one. And in the center, well, not quite in the center, just off center is a dot at the top of the sleeves. You want to mark that dot. That is really important because that's where your shoulder seam is going to join up with the sleeve, and you can see that it's not in the center. It's actually off center a little bit. And that's because we need more room in the back than we need in the front of our garment. So the next thing you want to watch out for is these two notches here and then this single notch here. This double notch is a universal indication that this is the back part of the sleeve. So I always mark this center dot on my sleeve and I mark the back notch. If you are at all uncomfortable about matching up your pattern, then certainly mark this notch too. But it's imperative that you know that this is a double notch. And if you're going to cut them out, don't cut into the seam allowance, cut it out. So if you cut around, cut out a little notch. I use pins. I just pin mine. I lay it on the pattern and I put a pin at the center dot and then I just throw a pin in the back. But that is certainly a comfort level. The next thing that we need for our sleeves is this sleeve I'm going to put a little bell band on the bottom of the sleeve. So we have these bands here and I sewed my band into a circle, right sides together. And then after I had my circle, I serged the edge of my band and I put a little baby hem on it. You can, because it's going to be a ruffle, you want something light. You don't want a double fold hem, so you need to finish the inside of this edge with something, either a zigzag or a pink, and then fold it over and do a little baby hem stitch on that. The next thing you need to do is to sew your gathering stitches. We're going to talk a little bit about gathering, but if you want all the 411 and gathering, I have a little video about that and I'll put the link in here. But this is my center seam, my center back seam. I want to find the center front of my piece so I know that I'm going to be able to balance it from front to back. And then I'm going to run long basting stitches away from where the seam allowance is. So if the seam allowance is here, I've done a row inside the seam allowance and outside the seam allowance, because you don't want to cross it over with the machine when you're stitching, because it's a nightmare to pull out. So we leave long threads so we can pull our basting stitches. And then we have our sleeve. So we folded our sleeve in half, right sides together, and we stitched up this little side seam here. So I've done that with my sleeve. And I've also run basting threads, same thing, but I've only run them from notch to notch all the way around the crown and then left this underarm open. We don't need any gathering down here underneath the arms. This is a 1-to-1. So we're going to attach our little ruffle to our sleeve. So I have the right side of my sleeve and I'm going to find, that's the wrong side, that's not going to help me any. I want the right side of my sleeve and I'm going to find the center front. So I'm just going to fold it at the seam. So here's my seam. I'm going to fold it and I'm going to find the center front. That way I can match it up with the banding, and it helps to ensure that the gathering is even around both sides of the sleeve. So here's my sleeve, right side up. Hear all that banging? They're putting in a new deck in my house. Sorry about that, but I'm really excited to have a new deck. And then here is the banding. So you can see how much bigger this is, how much gathering I need to do to get this to fit this right here. But this is my center pin on my banding. So I'm going to flip these right sides together and match up these two pins. So now I know that my gathering will be even because I'm going to match up the seams in the back. And the same thing, I'm going to butt one seam one way and one seam the other way. So now I have distributed this extra that I have to get attached to each side. And I'm going to pull, it's better if you pull the basting threads, but if you don't know which ones the basting threads are, either will do, but you want a thread from each row. So in this case, I want a thread from the top row I have one thread from the top row and one thread from the bottom row. And I'm going to give them a little tug, and as I tug, I'm going to pull the fabric and distribute these little ruffles as they go around until my ruffle piece is the same size as my sleeve. That looks pretty good. And then I'm just going to space them out and straighten them out because they crinkle, right? And they kind of turn in on themselves. They don't get very happy. So I'm just going to straighten them out. This is not smooth, right? It's a ruffle, so it's going to have little ruffle gatherings, and that's okay because that's the look. When we put the sleeve in, it's going to be a little bit different. So I'm just straightening out the ruffles and kind of distributing them across the entire piece here. And I need to gather this just a smidge more. So it fits. So I've done one half of my sleeve. You can see that the ruffles, right? Ruffles are attached to the sleeve. It's the same size, and I'm going to go ahead and sew it. If you're at all nervous, baste it first, because you can baste over the pins and then take it out and make sure you're happy with the way it's balanced or the way it looks, because sometimes when you're doing a ruffle, one of the pitfalls is that they slide sideways as you're sewing on your machine, and you can catch them up in there like that. If you have to rip that out, it's a pain in the butt. So pin it, baste it with the machine, and then go back and make sure it's good, and then you can go and sew it. So I'm going to do the other side of my sleeve. I'm going to drag that in. I'm going to catch the threads from this side and go this way this time, and I'm going to do my other sleeve, and then we'll come back and put our sleeves in. All right, I sewed my sleeve band, the little ruffle, on, and you need to finish it, especially if you're using a lightweight fabric, finish the edge off somehow. But see how cute that is? So here is my finished one, all pressed and ready to go, and we're going to attach this to the top. So here is my bodice, right, front neck edge, and I'm going to look at my markings and make sure that I know that which one is the back. So this is the back side of this sleeve, so I know that it goes on this side because the side is going towards the back. And you know, people freak out about putting sleeves on and just keep making sleeveless dresses or sleeveless tops all the time. They're not that hard. You just need a few simple tricks, and you can knock them out without any trouble at all. The first one is that you know which side goes on which side, and even after all these years of sewing, I still lay everything out in front of me so I know that this sleeve is going on the correct side. The other thing that you want to pay attention to is what we mentioned before, the gathering. The gathering goes, there's a space in between there where the seam allowance is. We don't want to go over the gathering because we want to be able to pull it out afterwards when it's finished. And we don't need to put gathering beyond the notches. This underarm part has no gathering to it. So now I have my sleeve laid out, that my pin is marked here to match up my shoulder seam. I want to keep the sleeve down to the feed dog. So I want to think about that when I'm pinning it, because I want the feed dogs to help me ease this sleeve in. So this is gathered, right? It's roughly and gathered. This is going to be eased. It's going to be nice and smooth. There's more room in the sleeve than there is in the arm, so we want to ease it in, but we don't want gathers and puckers. So I'm going to take this pin and I'm going to match it to my shoulder seam, but I'm going to go inside and put the right sides together because I want that pinning to be on my bodice part. So now I have my bodice shoulder seam and the pin of the top of my sleeve, and I'm just going to pin them together. So I know that that's the sleeve's on the right side, and now I can shake it all around to get it the way I want it. And the next pin I'm going to put in is the side seam and the bottom of my sleeve. So here is my sleeve, and I have my seam going in one direction, and I'm going to match it up with the bodice going in the different direction, and I'm going to pin that side seam and sleeve seam together. All right, so now I have this thing that looks like a mess, right? But we're gonna take it one chunk at a time. Remember, we said we didn't need any easing under the underarms, so I'm going to pin one side up to where the notch is, because that's the underarm, and it's 1-to-1. There's no easing, I don't need to worry about it. Then I'm gonna go to the other side and I'm gonna pin that. Same thing, 1-to-1, I'm just matching up the raw edges of the sleeve and I'm pinning them. Pretty much that's gonna take you to where you've started that basting. So now I've maneuvered this section so it's smaller on both sides. And I'm going to start with the basting stitches, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the ruffle. I'm going to take one from the top row and one from the bottom row and grab them and just slowly, and this isn't going to need much at all, just enough to bring that sleeve in a little bit so it fits into this circle here. Okay, now that we've pulled our gathers, we're going to start pinning. We're going to start from the shoulder seam, and we're just going to kind of lightly, we don't want any pleats in it, we just want to lightly pull the fabric and give it a little tension, and then we're going to match the edges of our seam allowance from our sleeve and our armhole opening together. And we're going to hope when we get to the end that they are the same size. And look at that, they are. Perfect. Perfect. So you can see that there is very little gathering going on there. And as I'm sewing that, I'm going to have my fingers there to make sure that I don't have, so I'm sewing it this way, right? Because I want the dress or the bodice on the top with the gathering in the bottom, because the feed dogs will help move a little bit of that ease in along the way, and I don't want any puckers when I open it up. I want my sleeve to be a nice continuous smooth mark from my shoulder seam all the way out. We're going to finish up the back of our dress, our bodice top. This looks beautiful, right? We have this lovely little square, beautiful square details. The points look great. We're going to stitch down our facings to our shoulder seams, and I added a small button to one side of the back neck edge because we need to close this, right? We need to be able to close it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a thread loop to go around this button. So a fairly good length of thread. And you're going to double it. So you're going to put a knot, thread it through your needle and double it. The needle threading is the hardest part. It's always the hardest part. There we go. So I'm going to double this, and I'm going to put a knot at the bottom. Now this is longer than I normally would have for a piece of thread. Normally I'd be around 15 or 18 inches. This is probably about 25 maybe. But I'm going to put a double knot at the end. And I just want a little tiny tail, so I'm going to snip off just below where the knot is, because I just want a little tiny double knot at the bottom, right? And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a loop that comes out around here, so it's going to go over this button. The first thing I want to do is, oh, I have a tail there. Let's get rid of that. I'm going to bring my thread up through the back of the facing because I want to come out right where that, pretty much right where that notch is. Not quite. Because I want this thread to go around the loop of the loop to go around the button, so I want it to be about the same. I'm going to pull that through. So now my knot is inside between my garment and my facing. You can't see it. And I'm just going to put a little anchor knot in. I'm just going to knot it and then go through the loop just to make sure that my double security, that my other knot doesn't come undone. And then I want to make a loop, and I want the loop to be a pretty good size, and I'm going to use my seam ripper as a gauge, and I'm just going to put it back in near the first original stitch to create my loop. So now I can take this out, and you can see that I've created a little loop. Now I do believe, and we'll just check, that loop is going to be, and it needs to be a little big because we're going to make it smaller, plus you want it to be able to move, so you want to make sure that it goes around your button. And as we cover it, it's going to get a little bit smaller. But I've knotted both ends now, so my loop isn't going anywhere. I can pull on it, my loop is staying put. What I'm going to do now is a little fiddly, and it just takes time, and we're going to build up the structure of the loop as we go. So we make a circle. We're putting our needle through the loop and the circle. You kind of have to hold on to it. And we're just making a knot all the way around. So we make a loop and we go through the circle. And they just start to stack on each other, a loop. And this is why you want it a little bit bigger, because your loop is going to tighten up a little bit as you do this. Whoops. And you want to make sure now that your threads stay together. So make a loop around your hand and push your needle through the loop. The needle is very slippery today. Loop through the needle. And what you can see is that I'm building up this, see where my thread is way up here? I'm building this loop up as I'm going through. So I'm actually adding some dimension to my loop. Now you can, the other alternative, if you don't want to do this, is you can sew something onto the back. If you, before you sew the facing on, if you sew a little elastic piece on the right side of the fabric, you can do that, and then when you sew your facing on, the ends of the ends of the elastic will be buried inside the seam allowance. So that's another alternative. I like this alternative better in case I need to make adjustments. And also, you know, if something happens and the elastic falls out, then you have a problem because now you have it stuck there. All right, maybe you can see better now. See how my loop is starting to take shape? So I'm going to fill that in all the way around and sink it, and that is the end of making a loop. It's pretty simple. All right, I just completed the last chain stitch around my loop. And what I'm going to do is just sink it back into that seam allowance, sink my needle back into that seam allowance, and give it a good little knot. And then my thread is misbehaving today. There we go. And then I'm just going to sink it into the fabric because I don't want to see the tail floating around. So I just slide it into the fabric, and then I can cut it off. And there we have a very classic closure. We have a loop and a little shirt button. Looks great, right? My points are even across the top here. I have a little bit of movement with that because you want a little bit of movement in the neck area. It's easy to button and unbutton, and it didn't take me more than a couple of minutes to finish. So, love that. One of the biggest issues I have with PDF patterns is this. You know, after you cut them apart, they're falling apart, they get crinkled, the paper isn't conducive to being folded. Sometimes it's just kind of a hot mess. So when I pulled out my skirt pieces, because I like to keep my pieces that I've cut out with my pattern, this is what I ended up with for my skirt. So I need to reconstruct this a little bit so I can make sure that we have some of our markings need to be in the right place. So this is the skirt front and the skirt back. And you know, you figure how much time you waste kind of doing this, and if you're really saving enough money to make it worth your while. I mean, this was a free pattern, so I guess I can't complain too much. But you know, I have to keep matching it up over and over and over again, so that is unpleasant for me because I want to get things done. I like to be like, let's do it, you know, let's finish it, let's get it done, let's do the best we can and use our time efficiently. So this will work. This is good enough for now. So one of the things we want to pay attention to on the skirt pattern piece is these circles here, because the circles are where we're going to leave the stitching open, right? This is the spot where our hand goes into our pocket. So our pocket fits all the way up into this top seam here. So the top of the pocket is going to be in the umpire waist seam, which is great because then it's not flopping around. It will stay put to the front of the garment. And you can match up this notch on your pocket piece to the notch that's on the skirt. But the important pieces that you want, the important markings that you want are these notch pieces here, the circle pieces here. So I'm going to mark the circle pieces on my skirt, and then I'm going to sew a pocket to each of the 4 sections of the front, the 2 sides for the front and the 2 sides for the back. Okay, we've sewn on our pocket to the right sides together, right side at the front of the skirt on each of the 4 seams that are on the skirt. And I have pressed it flat and then pressed the seam allowance towards the pocket. I love that this pocket goes up into the umpire waist seam. It makes such a beautiful pocket. So I've done 4 of those. I have 2 on this one. Here's my other pocket on this side, and then I have 2 on my other piece. After you have pressed them, you want to stitch them really close to the edge. I used my edger and I just run it along here, but really, really close to the edge. The understitching makes all the difference in the world in the pocket because you're gonna get, again, a really nice crisp seam, just like when we understitched the neckline. It's the exact same process. So the next thing that we need to do is, if we haven't already, you need to mark the dots on your tissue. Right, if you haven't marked these circles where the pockets go on your tissue, then you should do that now. That's where your hand is going to go. So when we sew the side seams, we start here at the top and we sew down to the dot, and then we stop and we start again at this dot and we sew down, and we also sew the pocket at the same time. So I'm going to be sewing this right sides together, front to back. What was I thinking? Folding it in half. That would have been a horrible boo-boo, right? Right sides together, front to back. So if we've sewn everything correctly and we've marked correctly, these should line up without any trouble at all. Now I have to go back and top stitch this pocket before I sew this, but I'm just going to show you for demonstration purposes. And I want to line up that seam there where my pocket is. And then line up my pocket bag all the way around. So I'm sewing the front to the back here. And my pocket. And then again, I'm going to line up this seam down here at the bottom of my pocket. And then all the way down to the bottom edge of my skirt. Now what I need to know, what those dots are going to tell me, is where to start and stop stitching. So here's the side, my pattern side seam. And I'm going to, this is one dot here. And I want to make sure that those seams, and I'll go back and check them, that those seams line up together, because we don't want them askew when we sew them. We want to make sure that they're butted up really close together. So we're going to sew from the top of the waist down to this first pin. And I would back tack. Then we're going to sew from the top of the pocket bag all the way around and up to this pin, and then down to the bottom. Well, just a couple of things about pockets. When you stitch this bottom piece, you stitch up to that pin, there's kind of an angle here. That's fine. We're going to press these pockets towards the front, and in order to keep your seam allowance open, I mean, you could press it all towards the front. I prefer for a pocket to split it in the back, and I'm just going to put a little notch right in there in that seam. Not my favorite thing to do, but I want this seam to lie open, and I want the pocket to go to the front. Now, to keep it easy while I'm sewing the waistband, I'm actually just going to baste this pocket along this umpire waistband with the, I'm just going to throw a couple of basting stitches in there so it doesn't flop around. And you want to make sure that both of your pockets are facing the same way, because the front and the back of the skirt are identical. It's a pretty easy skirt. There isn't a lot of shaping involved. The other thing I want you to think about is your pockets. Look at how beautiful that pocket is, right? We have this really nice opening. It lies really flat because I'm holding it up in the air, but it lies really flat. I've back stitched here and back stitched down here at the bottom because my hand's going to be going in and out of that, so I want to make sure that it stays put. And then also by basting this up here into the seam allowance, this pocket isn't going to be flopping around, which is absolutely fabulous. Now, the next thing you should do is try on your bodice. If you haven't already done it, you want to do that. Now, this bodice does suffer from no darting, so it is a little casual in fit, but you want to make sure that this piece that goes around the umpire waist piece is big enough or small enough. You want to make sure it's the right size, because now is the time to make that adjustment. If you need to take these side seams in a little bit to make it a little more fitted, then do so, because we're going to make this skirt fit this top. All right, so you can see that we have some space here, and what we're going to do is we're going to add pleats. Typically, we've been adding a lot of gathers. There's been a lot of gathers in the spring and summer looks, and they're trending into fall, but we're going to use gathers for this dress because pleats. I'm sorry, we're going to use pleats for this dress because I have a lot of dresses with gathers. So we're going to do the pleat version of this dress. Obviously, you knew that because we cut out the skirt. So on this lovely piece of PDF paper that's still falling apart even after I retaped it are the gathering marks here. So we are going to mark this center dot, and we are going to mark whatever size you did, you're going to mark the side dots. And those two side dots are going to come in to make the center to the center dot. They're going to meet. and that is going to form our pleat. Now I prefer the pleat, the side pieces, these two side dots, to come into my center dot. That way the pleat is on the inside and it's not popping out. You can do it the other way. You can do it the reverse. You can bring the two pleats, these two side pieces, into the back of the garment, and then your pleat will be forward. If you need a little more volume, that's a really good way to go. If you want something a little slimmer, take the pleats on the right side and bring them together in the front. So that's what we're going to do with this piece. So I'm going to mark up all my pleats and then I'll show you how to bring them together. All right, time to mark the pleats. So I have actually marked my pleats. You can see this is where the center dot is and the two side dots. If you're going to do this after you've cut everything out, make sure that you at least mark the center back of your skirt so you can align the pattern up correctly. This is the right side of my fabric, so it's facing up, and what I want to do is I want to pull these pleats together. So I want to take these two outside pins and I want to center them on this middle pin. And in the process of doing that, I want it to be straight across the top. So it can be a little fiddly. So that's one. And now I'm going to bring my second pin, which is coming apart. Bring my second pin into that center mark also, and line up the top. So you can see that the top of my garment is level and these two pins come together to meet. Now when you're sewing them, you're going to baste these on before you stitch this to the bodice. So you're just going to run a basting across the top, and I've done that with the two pleats from the front. And you can see I've just basted them together. So it just makes it easier for me to maneuver this piece of fabric without pins underneath and them flopping all around. And they're pretty close together. I just want to make sure that when I sewed this at about 3/8. When I sew the seam allowance at 5/8, I want to make sure that they're as close together as possible when I stitch them. So I'll probably come up to here, make sure the other one is really close, and then forward stitch them. And I also went back and I stitched down my pocket, so my pocket's not flopping around, it's attached to the waistband. So after I have put in my pleats, I am going to sew the top to the bottom. I'm going to match the side seams and pin it all the way around. It should be perfect, but if it's a little cattywampus, I can change these, or I can change the side seams if it doesn't quite fit. You want to make sure that you line up the center front and the center back and the side seams, and that is pretty easy to do. Let's talk about that really quickly. This is my bodice. I have the side seams, so that's easy. Since this is the same in the back and the front, I can actually pin the side seams together. You can't always do this, but they're the exact same size. Pin the side seams together and then take this piece out and put a pin in here, and that is my center back. And then do the same thing on this side and even up the seam allowances and put a pin in there, and that would be my center front. So when I open up the side seams again, now I have the dress in quadrants. I have a pin in the center front, a pin in the center back, and then each of the sides. And I do the same thing to the skirt. I have the two sides. I want the center front and the center back. Then I can line up those pins. Again, if you're at all nervous, baste it first. Take a look at it, make sure it's fine, and then stitch it. This is a 1-to-1. It should be nice and smooth. There's no gathering here. That's why we put the pleats in. Okay, we finished up 79.48 from McCall's. I've sewn the top to the bottom, and I just overlocked the edge and the hem edge and turned it up and stitched it on the machine, and the dress is finished. Now, it's hard to read in this video, but this is actually a gingham, and you'll see some close-up pictures of it. I have to say it's a little too Little House on the Prairie for me, with the little ruffles on the sleeves, and this high neckline doesn't do anything for me, and there is no darts. So there's no fitting darts in the top, which is really important. I like the pattern, but just not for me. I think it's something that would look much better on someone that's younger. I'll pop a picture up here, but you won't see too many of me in it because it will be going out of my closet. It won't be staying there. So here's what I look like in it. And I think it would be much cuter on someone that is younger and has a little bit more fun. In addition, this gingham is a little stiff. I think if it was a cotton lawn or even some kind of softer fabric, it would drape a little bit better. But right now, all I can think of is like a gunny sack dress. And a lot of that has to do with this fabric. I think it's just a little too stiff for the pattern. But we did a lot of great things. We put in pleats in the front here instead of gathers, because just to change it up. I mean, I've been making gathered dresses all summer and they're everywhere and I love them and they're floaty and comfortable and wonderful. So I thought I would try something a little different. We did a beautiful facing neckline, but you can see right here in the video why I don't like facings. Look at that. You can see that facing through the dress because the fabric is a little thin. It's a little sheer. I wouldn't say it's sheer, but it's a little see-through, right? You would put a slip under it. But you can see this, and that neckline is just, that facing is just one layer of the fabric with some interfacing on it. So I would rather do some kind of edge on the finish or line the whole bodice. And in this case, I wanted to do it because we wanted to go through the technique. Also, once you put the facing on like this, if you try it on, it's pretty hard to change the neckline. I prefer a longer neckline. It looks better on me. Some people can wear that. It's just not my style. So this may be your style, and it's adorable if it works for you. These really nice set-in sleeves, they went in really well. And then we have this really pretty keyhole opening in the back with our nice little button closure. And again, you can see this, you can see the facing, right? So you could do this same dress with a fully lined bodice, and we've done that before. You don't have to line the sleeves, just the bodice part, and we've done that before in other videos, and I'll put a link in so you can take a look at how that works. And then pleats here in the back too. So it really is a cute little dress. I think that oh yeah, and it has pockets, which, you know, we all love pockets, and it has really nice pockets. I think it's drafted, the pattern's drafted really well. The combination of the high neckline and no fitting darts in the top and this fabric just doesn't work for me, but that doesn't mean it's not going to work for you. I think it definitely has a place in the market, and I think you should give it a try if you like something that's a little has a lot of coverage but also is a little stylish. I mean, I think it actually might be cute without the sleeves, with a lower neckline. And I mean, I love the empire waist and these pleat details in the front and the back. It makes it very comfortable and a kind of a casual look, and I think in a nice softer cotton it would be a good choice for me. But for now, that's what we've got, and until next time, please give us a thumbs up. We would love to have you subscribe to our channel and keep on sewing. Bye.